Reinhard Heydrich was one of the most powerful and most feared figures in Nazi Germany, the architect of the Holocaust, the head of the Reich Security Main Office, and from September 1941 until his death in June 1942, the acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, the Nazi administrator of occupied Czechoslovakia. During his 9 months in Prague, Heydrich ruled with a combination of brutal terror and calculated propaganda, crushing Czech resistance while simultaneously attempting to win cooperation from Czech workers through selective benefits. He lived in extraordinary luxury and privilege, residing in a confiscated villa that symbolized Nazi occupation and the subordination of Czech sovereignty to German power. When Czech and Slovak resistance fighters trained in Britain assassinated Heydrich in May 1942, inflicting wounds that killed him a week later, his death became one of the most significant acts of resistance against Nazi occupation and led to terrible reprisals, including the complete destruction of the village of Lidice. But what happened to Heydrich's villa in Prague after World War II ended? Was it destroyed, preserved, repurposed, or simply forgotten? How did Czechoslovakia and later the Czech Republic deal with this physical reminder of Nazi occupation and of one of the Holocaust's principal architects? Today, we'll trace the history of Heydrich's Prague residence, from his occupation of it in 1941 through the decades after the war, examining its various uses, the controversies surrounding it, and what its story reveals about how societies deal with the architectural legacy of oppression and evil. This is a narrative about memory and forgetting, about how buildings associated with terrible crimes can be repurposed while never entirely escaping their dark histories, and about the ongoing challenges of deciding what to do with physical spaces that once housed monsters. To understand what happened to Heydrich's villa after the war, we must first understand the villa itself and Heydrich's occupation of it. The building in question is a large villa located in the Pankrak district of Prague, built in the early 20th century as a luxurious private residence. Before World War II, it belonged to a wealthy Czech industrialist who was forced to flee or surrender the property when Nazi Germany occupied Czechoslovakia in March 1939. The villa is an impressive structure in the style fashionable among the wealthy in early 20th century Central Europe, with multiple floors, elegant rooms, beautiful details, and extensive grounds. Its architecture reflects the prosperity and culture of pre-war Czechoslovakia, making its appropriation by the Nazis particularly symbolic of the occupation's violence and theft. When Reinhard Heydrich was appointed acting Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia in September 1941, he needed an official residence in Prague from which to govern, and in which to live with his wife Lena and their children, who accompanied him to Prague. The Nazi authorities selected this villa in Pankrak for Heydrich's residence, choosing it for its size, its elegance, its location, and its suitability for both official and private functions. The villa was requisitioned, meaning stolen, from its Czech owners, and was prepared for Heydrich's occupation. The building was furnished luxuriously with furniture and artworks, some specifically acquired for the purpose, and some likely looted from other sources, creating a residence suitable for one of the most powerful men in the Nazi hierarchy. Heydrich, his wife Lena, and their 3 children, Klaus, Heider, and Silke, moved into the villa and lived there from September 1941 until Heydrich's assassination in May 1942. For Heydrich, the villa served multiple functions. It was his private residence where he spent time with his family when his brutal work schedule permitted. It was also a venue for official functions, including receptions, dinners with German officials and military officers, and meetings with collaborators and others involved in administering the protectorate. The villa symbolized Heydrich's power and the Nazi occupation's dominance, representing in physical form the subordination of Czech sovereignty to German rule. Heydrich's daily routine when in Prague involved commuting from the villa to Prague Castle, where his official offices were located, a journey that would prove fatal. On May 27, 1942, as Heydrich was being driven from his villa in Pankrak to Prague Castle, his car was attacked by Czech and Slovak resistance fighters, Josef Gabčík and Jan Kubiš, who had been trained in Britain and parachuted into Czechoslovakia specifically to assassinate Heydrich. The attack occurred at a hairpin turn where the car had to slow down, providing the attackers with their opportunity. Gabčík's Sten gun jammed when he attempted to shoot Heydrich, but Kubiš threw a modified anti-tank grenade that exploded near the car, sending shrapnel and fragments into Heydrich's body. Initially, Heydrich seemed to have suffered only moderate injuries, and he was taken to a hospital, where doctors attempted to treat his wounds. However, infection set in, likely from fragments of the car's upholstery and from clothing that had been driven into his body by the explosion, and despite surgery and medical care, Heydrich's condition deteriorated. He died on June 4, 1942, exactly 1 week after the attack, at age 38. The Nazi response to Heydrich's assassination was massive and brutal, demonstrating the regime's reliance on terror to maintain control. Hitler ordered savage reprisals against the Czech population. The villages of Lidice and Ležáky were completely destroyed, their male populations executed, women and children deported to concentration camps or killed, and the villages themselves razed and removed from maps. Thousands of other Czechs were arrested throughout the Protectorate, and many were executed in the wave of revenge terror. The 2 assassins and several other Czech resistance fighters involved in the operation were eventually tracked to a church in Prague, where they died in a battle with SS troops, either killed in fighting or committing suicide to avoid capture. Heydrich was given an elaborate state funeral in Berlin, with Hitler, Himmler, and other top Nazi leaders in attendance, and he was eulogized as a fallen hero and martyr to the Nazi cause. But what happened to Heydrich's villa after his death, and particularly after the war ended? In the immediate aftermath of Heydrich's assassination, the villa continued to be used by Nazi authorities. It was not destroyed or abandoned, but rather was reassigned to other German officials working in the Protectorate administration. The building remained under German control until May 1945, when Soviet and American forces liberated Czechoslovakia, and when the Nazi occupation ended. As German forces retreated, and as the occupation collapsed, many buildings that had been used by Nazi authorities were abandoned, looted, or damaged, and the transition from German occupation to restoration of Czech control was chaotic. When Czechoslovakia was liberated in May 1945, the villa that had been Heydrich's residence was among the many properties that had been confiscated by the Nazis, and that now needed to be dealt with by the restored Czechoslovak government. The immediate post-war period in Czechoslovakia was characterized by enormous challenges, including rebuilding a devastated country, dealing with displaced populations, prosecuting collaborators, and confronting the trauma of 6 years of brutal occupation. The question of what to do with buildings that had been used by Nazi occupiers was not the highest priority, but it was nonetheless a question that required answers as the government reasserted control over state property and as decisions had to be made about utilization of buildings. The Heydrich villa's history after 1945 reflects broader patterns of how Czechoslovakia and later the Czech Republic dealt with the architectural legacy of Nazi occupation. Rather than destroying the building or treating it as a memorial to Nazi crimes, the decision was made to repurpose it for practical use by the restored Czechoslovak state. This pragmatic approach characterized the treatment of many Nazi-era buildings in Czechoslovakia and in other countries that had been occupied, reflecting the reality that destroying every building the Nazis had used would have been wasteful and impractical, and that repurposing buildings for new uses was a way to reclaim them from their association with occupation. In the years immediately after the war, the villa was used by Czechoslovak government agencies for various administrative purposes. The specific agencies and uses varied over the decades, but the building generally served as office space, meeting rooms, and administrative facilities for government ministries or for related organizations. This utilization allowed the building to serve practical functions while avoiding the creation of any kind of memorial or shrine that might commemorate Heydrich or Nazi occupation. The approach was to treat the villa as simply a useful building that happened to have a dark history, subordinating that history to current practical needs. During the communist period from 1948 to 1989, when Czechoslovakia was under Soviet influence and communist rule, the villa continued to be used for government purposes. The communist government's approach to historical memory emphasized resistance to Nazi occupation and celebrated the liberation by the Soviet Red Army. But it was less interested in preserving or memorializing the physical sites associated with Nazi occupation unless they served specific propaganda purposes. The Heydrich Villa did not fit into the narrative the communist government wanted to promote, as it was more a symbol of German occupation than of Czech or Slovak resistance or of Soviet liberation. Therefore, the building continued to be used practically for administrative purposes, without particular attention to its historical significance. The lack of public memorialization or even public acknowledgement of the villa's history during the communist period meant that for decades, many Czechs and international visitors did not know about the building's association with Heydrich. Unlike some sites associated with Nazi crimes that were preserved as memorials and museums, Heydrich's villa remained a functioning government building with no plaques, no historical interpretation, and no public access. This absence of memorialization reflected several factors, including the practical need for office space, the communist government's approach to historical memory, and perhaps also a desire to avoid creating any site that might attract neo-Nazis or that might seem to commemorate rather than condemn Heydrich and the occupation. After the Velvet Revolution of 1989 that ended communist rule in Czechoslovakia, and that led to the establishment of democratic governance, and particularly after the peaceful dissolution of Czechoslovakia into the Czech Republic and Slovakia in 1993, attitudes toward historical memory and toward sites associated with the Nazi occupation began to evolve. The post-communist Czech Republic has been more open about confronting difficult aspects of its history, including the occupation years, and there has been more public discussion about how to remember and interpret sites associated with Nazi rule. However, the Heydrich villa has remained relatively obscure, even in this changed environment. In recent decades, the villa has continued to be used for administrative purposes, housing offices, for various Czech government agencies or organizations. The building is not open to the public and remains a functioning workplace rather than a museum or memorial site. There is no prominent signage identifying it as Heydrich's former residence, and most Czechs walking or driving past the building would not know its historical significance unless they were specifically familiar with the history. This continued practical use without prominent memorialization reflects an approach that treats the building as having historical interest, but not as a site that requires special treatment, or that should be preserved specifically because of its association with Heydrich. The question of whether the Heydrich villa should be more prominently identified, interpreted, or even converted into a museum or memorial has been debated occasionally by Czech historians, journalists, and activists interested in historical memory. Those who argue for greater recognition and interpretation of the site contend that it has educational value, that acknowledging what happened there contributes to understanding the occupation period, and that ignoring or hiding the site's history is a form of historical amnesia. They suggest that at minimum, a plaque or marker should identify the building's history, and some have proposed more extensive interpretation, including possibility of museum exhibits or educational programs focused on the occupation and on resistance to it. However, there are also arguments against prominent memorialization of Heydrich's villa. Some contend that creating any kind of memorial or tourist destination associated with Heydrich risks glorifying him or attracting neo-Nazis and other extremists who might view the site as a place to pay homage to a Nazi leader. This concern is not theoretical, as various sites associated with Nazi leaders in Germany and elsewhere have struggled with the problem of neo-Nazi tourism and with inappropriate veneration by extremists. There is a genuine tension between the educational value of preserving and interpreting such sites and the risk that they might be misused by those who admire rather than condemn the historical figures associated with them. Another argument against special treatment of the Heydrich villa is that it was simply Heydrich's residence rather than a site where specific crimes were committed. Unlike concentration camps where millions were murdered, or like the site of the Wannsee Conference where the Holocaust was coordinated, Heydrich's villa was primarily his home, and only secondarily a site of official functions. While his residence symbolizes the occupation and his presence in Prague, no specific atrocities occurred at the villa itself, and some argue that memorializing it would be disproportionate compared to the attention given to sites where actual crimes took place. From this perspective, the villa's current use as ordinary office space is appropriate, and creating special historical interpretation would give undue emphasis to a building whose significance is primarily symbolic. The physical condition of the villa has been maintained over the decades as it has remained in use, meaning the building has been repaired and updated as necessary for its functioning as office space. This maintenance has preserved the structure, but has also modified it as offices have been created, modern facilities installed, and various changes made to adapt the building to contemporary needs. These modifications mean that the villa as it exists today is not exactly as it was when Heydrich lived there, though the basic structure and external appearance remain recognizable. If there were ever a decision to convert the building into a museum, it would require historical research and possibly some restoration work to understand and potentially recreate how the villa appeared and functioned during Heydrich's occupation. The question of who owns the villa is relevant to any discussion of its future use. As a building that was confiscated by the Nazis and that passed to the Czechoslovak government after the war, the villa is state property owned by the Czech Republic. This means that decisions about its use and about whether to change that use rest with Czech government authorities rather than with private owners. The building's status as government property makes it possible for the government to decide to repurpose it for historical interpretation, if there were political will and resources to do so. But it also means that decisions about the building are subject to competing priorities for government resources and attention. Comparison of the Heydrich villa's post-war history with that of other buildings associated with Nazi leaders in Prague and elsewhere provides useful context. Prague Castle, which served as Heydrich's official headquarters and where he had his offices, is a major historical site and tourist destination, though its association with Heydrich is just one small part of its long history as the seat of Czech and Bohemian rulers. The castle is interpreted primarily for its earlier history and for its current role as the seat of the Czech presidency, with the Nazi occupation period being acknowledged but not emphasized. Other buildings in Prague that were used by Nazi authorities have similarly been repurposed for contemporary uses without extensive historical interpretation, reflecting the general approach of reclaiming these spaces rather than preserving them as Nazi sites. In Germany, the approach to buildings associated with Nazi leaders has varied depending on the specific building and its history. Hitler's Munich apartment building was deliberately made ugly and unremarkable to discourage neo-Nazi tourism. The site of Hitler's Berghof mountain retreat was left as ruins and undeveloped land for decades, with very minimal interpretation, though in recent years a documentation center has been built nearby to provide historical context. The building in Berlin where the Wannsee Conference was held, where the Holocaust was coordinated, has been converted into a memorial and educational center with extensive exhibits about the genocide. The variety of approaches reflects the complexity of deciding how to deal with Nazi architectural legacy, with no single solution being appropriate for all cases. The specific site of Heydrich's assassination, the hairpin turn in Prague where Gabčík and Kubiš attacked his car, has received more attention and interpretation than his villa. A memorial plaque marks the location of the attack, and it has become a site where people come to remember the assassination and to honor the resistance fighters who carried it out. This memorial focuses appropriately on the act of resistance rather than on Heydrich himself, celebrating courage and resistance rather than commemorating the Nazi leader. The church where the assassins and other resistance fighters made their last stand and died, the Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius, has been converted into a memorial and museum dedicated to the resistance and to the men who died there. This memorial attracts visitors interested in World War II history and in the story of the assassination, providing educational interpretation about the operation, the resistance, and the terrible reprisals that followed. The contrast between the attention given to sites of resistance like the assassination location and the church, and the relative obscurity of Heydrich's villa, reflects appropriate priorities in historical memory. The emphasis is on remembering resistance and victims, rather than on commemorating or focusing on the perpetrators. This approach is consistent with broader practices in Holocaust and World War II memorialization, which generally prioritize remembering victims and honoring those who resisted over dwelling on the criminals themselves. From this perspective, the villa's continued use as ordinary office space without special identification or interpretation may be exactly right, allowing the building to serve practical purposes without creating any kind of focus on Heydrich himself. However, there remains an argument that complete silence about the villa's history is also problematic, as it represents a kind of forgetting or denial of what happened. Some historians and educators argue that acknowledging the full history of occupation requires confronting not just the sites of resistance and suffering, but also the sites where the oppressors lived and worked, understanding how they exercised power and how occupation functioned in practice. From this perspective, interpreting Heydrich's villa would contribute to comprehensive understanding of the occupation period and would serve educational purposes, particularly if interpretation emphasized the brutality of Heydrich's rule, the suffering he caused, and the resistance that ultimately killed him. In recent years, there has been increased interest in the history of Heydrich's time in Prague, partly driven by books and films about his assassination, including the 2016 film Anthropoid and the 2017 film The Man with the Iron Heart, both of which dramatized Operation Anthropoid, the code name for the assassination mission. These cultural products have brought renewed attention to Heydrich's role in Prague and to the story of his assassination, and they have generated interest among tourists and history enthusiasts who visit Prague wanting to see sites associated with these events. Some of these visitors seek out Heydrich's former villa, though they find an unmarked office building with no public access or interpretation, which can be disappointing for those interested in the history, but also appropriate in that it avoids any glorification. The ethical and practical questions about what to do with buildings associated with historical criminals extend beyond Heydrich's villa to numerous other cases. Throughout Europe and beyond, societies have struggled with how to handle the architectural legacy of Nazism, of other fascist regimes, of communist dictatorships, and of colonial oppression. The range of approaches includes complete destruction to erase symbols of oppression, preservation as warning and memorial, with strong educational interpretation emphasizing crimes and victims, repurposing for new uses with minimal acknowledgement of problematic history, and in some unfortunate cases, neglect that allows buildings to deteriorate, or tacit acceptance that allows continued association with the terrible history. No approach is perfect for all cases, and decisions require balancing multiple considerations, including historical truth, educational value, respect for victims, prevention of glorification, practical utility, and resource constraints. The current status of Heydrich's villa as a functioning government office building, with little public recognition of its history, represents one point on this spectrum of approaches, prioritizing practical use and avoidance of glorification over historical interpretation and education. Whether this is the right approach is debatable and may evolve as Czech society continues to grapple with how to remember and interpret its World War II history. Future generations may decide that more prominent acknowledgement and interpretation is appropriate, or they may conclude that the current approach of practical use without special status is exactly right. These decisions ultimately rest with Czech society and government, as it is their history and their property, to interpret and utilize as they determine.